will hand over the same. Coles Park, Mr. Peter K.M., Mr. Mani K., Mrs. Cora John, Mrs. Charco's AI, Mrs. Tangama Samuel, Mrs. Thomas TV, Mrs. Sarah Machako, Mrs. Amini George, and Mrs. Akama Joseph were absent. Hebal Ward, Mr. Paulos PP, Mr. George CP, Mrs. Givargis O, Mr. PC Matthew and Mrs. Eliama Matthew. Mr. Chaco MA, Mr. IKA, Mrs. Molly Ipe, Mrs. Mary Kochu and Mrs. Chinama John were absent. S.G. Palya, Mr. George C.C., Mrs. Annakutti P.T. and Mrs. Anama Verghese, and Mr. Joseph T.A. Mr. Jacob Zachariah and Mrs. Eliama K.E. were absent. Joseph T.A. I'd like to request Mr. Joseph T.A. to receive the memento. Jayanagar, Mr. John C., Mr. Babykutti P.Y. I'd like to request the respective committee members to help us. Mrs. Mary Joyce, Mrs. Leelama John, Mr. E.M. Kocheppan, Mr. George P.I., Mrs. Sarama P.V. This is the Jayanagar ward. Mr. Babu Kora C., Mr. Matai Samuel P., Mrs. Kunyama Matai, Mr. Matthew P.M., Mrs. Gracie Matthew, Mrs. Annie Jacob, and Mrs. Tangama George are absent. We move to the Indiranagar ward. We have we move to the Indiranagar ward. Okay. Mr. Thomas A.V., Mr. Philip K.V., Mr. Philip K.V., Mr. Thomas Evie, Mr. Verghese PM, Mr. Abraham MC, Mrs. Sosama Abraham, Mr. Charco Casey, Mrs. Akama Chaco, Mr. John E.G., Mrs. Sarama John, Mrs. Susie Simon, Mrs. Sarama John, Mrs. Thomas Matthew, Mrs. Thomas Matthew, Mrs. Thomas Matthew, Mr. Matthew Tarakan C. and Mrs. Sosama Tarakan. Mr. Samuel P.I. and Mrs. Sheila Samuel. Mr. Rajan Matthew, Mr. Verghese P. John, Mrs. Sosama Verghese,